Hello everyone, and let's go into a new lecture. I'm gonna teach you basics of the Nimzo Indian. I know that you heard about this opening so many times. Whoever read those famous Nimzovich book, he gave so many examples with the Nimzo Indian games. Then throughout all these super tournaments, you face that opening so much. And I'm just going to try to present you like the few basic ideas and to help you to be able, against d4, which could be very annoying, to have at least a couple of first moves where you shouldn't have problems if you play against even, let's just say, booked up opponents. So let's begin immediately. Let's get straight to the point. So when they play d4, you play knight f6. You know that when you play knight f6, you just go for the Indian systems. They go c4 and you go e6. The idea of e6 is to open up the dark square bishop, and basically you'd like to place that bishop on b4 once they put the knight on c3. There we go. Nimzo Indian can only happen if your opponent goes for knight c3. And statistically speaking, that's the most common move in practice, especially on lower and medium levels. So this is going to be especially good video for those who are willing to get like a good, to grasp and to get like a good grasp of those, let's just say, first few moves of the main lines there. So when they play knight c3, we've got a Nimzo Indian. What's the difference? What's the point of g3? It's Catalan defense. And against Catalan defense, I suggest you to play d5 and to fight for the center, and that's a good opening. If they play knight f3, it's the Queen's Indian defense. And the Queen's Indian with the knight f3, you have Bogo Indian with the bishop b4, but you also have b6, a typical Queen's Indian, which could be my suggestion, but we're going to talk about these openings maybe some other time. Today's subject is knight c3 and classic Nimzo Indian. In order to play successfully this opening with the black pieces, you need to understand what do they want. Well, they want to play e4, and everything in Nimzo Indian is going to be about the strong white center. If you give them center, right, that you almost lost your game and that you can just go home, and probably this game shouldn't be for you, and probably you just have to go for something else. Do the science, play anything else, but chess is not for you. So basically, don't forget about this one. They just want to go with e4. If they play e4, you're dead. So when they play knight c3 to go with e4, you play bishop b4. Of course that you can play d5, but d5 goes into the Queen's Gambit Orthodox. Of course that you can play c5, but after d5, it's going to transpose into the Benoni defense. Those are not the subject of this lecture. You just go with the bishop b4, and you know what? Your opponent cannot play e4. And from this point onwards, like I told you, I'm going to give you like few basic steps and ideas and moves to treat these openings well. Statistically speaking, there are two moves here for white. Those are a3, which is called the Rubinstein variation, and queen c2, one of the most solid one, and many of them call it Kasparov variation, happen in more than 80% of the games, which means that we roughly have these two moves in more than 40% of cases. 40% queen c2, 40% e3, and we can just say the rest of these moves that I'm going to show you here, a3, f3, bishop g5, bishop d2, we have in like the rest like 5% on each move. Let's take a look at these moves. One of the most typical questions that I get from my students is a3. Maya, what are we supposed to do after a3? Nothing. When they play a3, you just take on c3. And when they play b takes c3, you've just created something. You just created double pawns. But it's very important to understand what is real weakness in the black's game. Is it pawn on c3 or pawn on c4? Good Nimzo players know it's the pawn on c4. And everything what I'm going to give you here is going to be a plan. Nothing more than that. So what do you have to do? You got to play c5, offering your opponent to triple his pawns, which would be terrible for him. Giving yourself opportunity to go with the queen on a5. But more importantly, I gotta show you, apart from queen a5, what should be your plan right now. I simply deleted all these arrows, and I just have to show you all together with queen a5, which is going to happen if they play like this. You just need to know how to play against the c4 weakness. Let's imagine they go with e3. You just go knight c6, and all you have to remember, play b6, bishop a6, knight a5, and put all your forces against the pawn on c4. That's why pawn on c4 should be, treated as a weakness and not the pawn on c3. Yes, those are both double pawns, but c4, that's the pawn you have to fight against. Another line is same-ish variation with f3, and wow, they really threaten to play e4. In these positions, you have so many options. For example, you can play short castle where you allow them to play e4, and in which case you just go with d5 and break the center. Then you can go with c5, or you can go with d5, directly preventing and fighting against e4 by white. But here, I'm just going to give you indirect type of fighting against e4. You play c5. They can't play e4 because simply you would take and bring your knight with tempo, and then you go d5 or short castle, queen a5, and have a great game. That's why after f3, you have direct way of fighting with d5, you have indirect way of fighting with c5, and you also have like short castle. Here I'm suggesting c5. When you play c5, everybody will play d5, and I will always choose for you some tricky lines. Castles, they go e4, looks like they've just built up a strong center, and I usually teach my students to play rook e8. Not everyone, of course, that's just one of the options. There is line with e takes d5, d6, b5, so many other things, but I like rook e8. I'll show you why. Lots of guys go with e5, and then you just take on d5, and you win the pawn on e5. So they can't push e5. Then I played against one woman GM, and I instantly won the game. She played bishop g5. That was a blitz game. I captured on d5. She captured. And how do you win? You basically take advantage of the king being here in the center and the pawn on e4. So you just take on e4. If bishop takes d8, you just take knight c3, you take the queen, eventually you take the bishop, and you should be up a piece. That's why after rook e8, they have to go knight g on e2, and you just go d6. So when they play knight g3, so they can play bishop e2 and short castle, you just break the center with b5. If they take, you take on d5, and you have a great game, and that's absolutely enough for every single one of you. So this is a great starting point to know your openings and to have even not more than a decent opening position. Then there is a Leningrad variation. You know that the Leningrad is city in Russia that is called St. Petersburg today. So bishop g5 is a very interesting line. A very annoying one if you don't know how to play against that. It used to be popular like 40-50 years ago, but once again you just have to indirectly fight against the center and play c5. You once again threaten to take on d4 and to jump with the knight on c6. That's why they have to play d5. When they do it, you take once, and I especially like this system where you play d6, bring your knight, for example they play e3, bring your knight to d7, so I can overprotect my knight on f6 and eventually go with the queen a5, pressuring this knight on c3 and fighting with some knight e4 and fighting for the center like this. This is a very nice one. And finally, in these sidelines, a very common approach by weaker guys could be bishop d2. Not only by weaker guys, but usually they go for that because they understand that you want to take on c3 and double their pawns, and they don't want to give you that privilege. So you just go with castle short, and when they go with knight f3, you just go with b6. I insist on this move because they couldn't play. If you ever wonder, could they play for? No, they can't. They cannot, because you have this bishop on before Nimzo bishop, and then you win the pawn. And that's why those who just continue to develop themselves, you're probably wondering, what are we supposed to do with the light square bishop? Do we have usually problems with the light square bishop? In Nimzo Indian, that's not a problem. That's one of your key strategic pieces. So you go with b6, e3, and bishop b7. And once again, I put my king in safety. Knight on f6, all together with the bishop on b7. They both control e4, and all together with the bishop on b4 that is gonna be given for the knight once they play a3. On your question, should we give up this bishop for the knight on c3? We do it in 99% of cases, but we usually do it once they force us to take. We want them to lose the tempo. There are specific lines where you're not supposed to do that, but I'm just giving you like the general principles here. And finally, if they play bishop d3 to complete development, you want to go with something. Now, I should either go with d6, knight bd7, which is flexible approach, or I should go with d5. Even though I'm closing my bishop on b7, I just want to play knight bd7, or even play c5, or even take on c4 and get a pretty decent Nimzo Indian game. And finally, I just have to show you those two moves when they play queen c2 and a3. Queen c2, it's so-called Kasparov line. It happens so often nowadays. There are some special guys, not only Kasparov, but all these top guys who play queen c2 on regular basis. The main principle is that they want to have a healthy pawn structure and the bishop pair. Well, you have a pretty decent game and control of the center. Against queen c2, you have so many options. You can play d5, directly fighting against e4 in the center. But the point of queen c2 is not only to play e4, but more importantly to take by queen on c3 once they force you with a3 to take it. Another thing is, after queen c2, you can play this indirect way of fighting against the center with c5. That's another thing, and usually they just have to take on c5, and then there are so many other lines. You can play knight a6, queen a5, knight c6, and you can even take on c5. And finally, I opted for the most logical thing. Well, I just played knight f6, bishop b4. Let me just make castle and put my king in a safety. When in this position, you try to do e4. Literally, this is the only variation where I allow to my opponents to play e4. Then I'm breaking in the center with d5. I'm pretty fast because any e5, I'm just gonna have knight here, and I'm going to undermine the center, either with c5 or f6, and getting into some sort of initiative along the f file. This is a good thing, and this is what you have to do. After queen c2 castles, most of these guys will play a3. That's the most common approach by white players. Well, they put a queen on c2 to overprotect knight on c3, to have like ideal way of defending this knight and be absolutely flexible. You take on c3, they capture by queen. Look at this flexibility by white. They have a pretty fine queen on c3. They have a hyper solid and healthy pawn structure, and they have the bishop pair. What do we have in return? We have control of the center. How should we play? Once again, so many ways. My suggestion and my vote goes to b6. You go bishop b7. And on your question, how should you develop your knight? You should play d6 and place your knight on d7. By placing your knight on d7, you're going to get flexible knights. Why flexible? Knight on d7 defends the knight on f6. Why bishop b7? Controlling e4. Why d6 and not d5? You just want to have an open bishop on b7. Why not knight c6? Because you don't want to block your bishop on b7. Eventually, what's your plan? One rook goes to e8, queen goes on e7, this one goes on c8, and you break with c5. And finally, I just want to show you an interesting approach against e3. Even Nimzo, which in his book My System, used to play those variations, and I believe for you it should be absolutely fine. You should be going with b6, bishop b3, bishop b7. You now threaten to take on g2, but at the same time you take like full control of the center, and once again famous e4 square. When they go with knight f3, you just go with short castle, And when they go with short castle, this is one of those moments, one of those, let's just say, exceptions, when your bishop on b4 is not threatened and you have to come up with something. So here, my approach and my idea is to take on c3, create these double pawns, and more importantly, to teach you the following plan. Once again, this is something for you to see the beauty of these openings, to see the simplicity of Black's plans, but it's at the same time to teach you some very nasty tricks. So you just go with the knight on e4, and for the first time, we see the benefit of the bishop on b7, all together with the knight on e4, fighting against these two pawns. Here, after knight c3, are you threatening to take on c3? Not exactly. That's not a point, because if you play that, they will play queen c2 and knight is trapped. So the point of knight e4, don't mix it up. It's not to take on c3. It's to play f5. And we call this mix of Nimzo Indian and Dutch defense Nimzo Dutch. So when they play like queen c2, attacking this knight on e4, you just go with f5. f5 is a specialty because it keeps the full flexibility and it keeps the bishop on b7 being open. Pawn on f5 controls the knight on e4. But more importantly, for the first time, it gives you a rook lifting ideas with the attack. So, how do you have to play if it's Black's turn? Of course, it's White's turn, but if it's Black's turn, rook goes on f6, and as long as the knight stands on f3, your rook is going to end up on g6. As soon as they move the knight from f3, your rook is going to go on h6. Remember those two roles. And we're about to see something very beautiful. I found more than 50, 60 games with a4, and that's a very common approach by white players. You play rook f6, and there we go. I want to show you a game of mine. I played a blitz game on ICC many years ago. The guy played a5, I played rook g6. So remember, your rook, all together with the knight on e4 and bishop on b7, goes on g6 as long as the knight is on f3. My opponent didn't see like true point of this, and he just played something like, I don't know, maybe he played, I believe he took on b6, and he probably thought I would take, he would recapture, and it's an interesting game. Take a look at this beautiful end of that game of mine with the knight e2. So look at this. I'm having rook, bishop, I'm threatening knight on f3, and can you believe it, I'm placing this knight on d2, being attacked by knight on f3, by bishop on c1, by queen on c2, and you're completely winning. The thing is, if they take by bishop, no guys, you don't take on f3 because they will play g3. You now sack your rook. That's how my game ended. He captured by king. I played queen g5, and he couldn't take because I delivered checkmate, so he resigned. In the case of king h3, it's just queen g4 checkmate. Another thing, after knight g6, knight e2, they take on d2 by knight. You just give check, and you know what? You always begin your thinking process with checks. You double check, they take it, and you just deliver checkmate with the queen and the bishop. And finally, if they just go with anything else but this, you're just going to take on f3, and they're just going to get mated. So after rook f6, those who are a little bit familiar with the defensive patterns, they're just going to move the knight. The best way to move the knight is knight on e1. That could give them reasonable defensive chances. Although, what happens if they just go back, for example, with the knight goes back on d2? Now, since the knight is not on f3 anymore, your rook goes on h6, and you support the queen h4. And just because of attractiveness of this lecture, I just want to end this lecture in a nice mode. So you're threatening queen h4. What happens if they play h3? Nothing. I found a couple of games, knight d2, bishop d2, and rook h3. They cannot take it because you just go queen g5 and queen g2 checkmate. What if bishop e4? Queen h4, threatening mate. You want to take the bishop back. And after this, you just play f takes e4. You just play d6, knight d7, include another rook into the action, and the checkmate is going to come. What if f3? On f3, you just go queen h4, threatening on h2. They take, you give check. You go here, threatening on g2. They got to defend. You take on e4. play rook f6, and you win this rook and win the game. I found a few games like that. A guy who was 2500 lost a game like this with the white pieces. And finally, you're probably wondering, well, you showed us h3, you showed us f3, bishop e4, but wait a sec, you said that he's threatening queen h4 and you don't want to defend it. So I play g3 so you cannot play queen h4. Who says that? You said that I can't play queen h4. What are you talking about, baby? So you just go queen h4, threatening checkmate. Your opponent says, what the hell? What if I take? Check. This one. Da-da-da-da. Double check. And this is mate. What a nice mating net with the bishop, knight, and the rook. Then you say, but wait. This is just the most obvious trick. Wait, let me just go with a knight, defend my pawn on h2, threaten your queen. Where is your attack now? What did you say? Where is my attack? Knight g5, baby. So you go with the knight g5, you open up the bishop on b7, and look what's happening. They take by knight. Boom. Knight h3, bishop b7, made the king. He takes by pawn. You give check. He goes here. You can't stop checkmate on h2. Aha, but I'll go king g2, man. I won few blitz games like this. Double check by knight and the bishop. If you go here, this is mate. If they go here, you give check with the bishop. They go here, you give check. They go here, you give check. They go here, and I'll choose. This is a very sweet a choice. Knight f3 checkmate, or you just want to go with the knight c6 checkmate. In both cases, king is mated in the middle of the board. And finally, if they just go with the knight g5, you deliver checkmate. Hope that you enjoyed this lecture about these few steps for proper Nimzo Indian and fighting against the first move d4. If you like it, support it. Donations. Thank you. Bye-bye.